Lorado Malef was 27, smart, ambitious, and studying law at the University of Johannesburg. She lived in a beautiful house in Sandton with her wealthy father, Mr. Malef, her glamorous stepmother Thandi, and her half-brother Cabello. Life should have been good, but it never felt like home. Ever since her mother passed away, everything changed. Her father remarried quickly, and Thandi made sure Lorado always knew she didn't belong. From the beginning, Thandi and Cabello treated her like an outsider. They mocked her dreams of becoming a lawyer, laughed at her cheap clothes, and called her the charity child when her father wasn't around. Slowly, they began turning Mr. Malef against her, whispering lies, twisting her words, and making her look ungrateful. Lorado tried to hold on, believing her father would see the truth. But then he got sick, and everything fell apart. While her father was in and out of the hospital, Thandi took control of everything: the family business, the bank accounts, even Lorado's education fund. One afternoon, Lorado gathered the courage to confront her. "You can't just take everything," she said, voice shaking. Thandi only smiled coldly and replied, "This house isn't yours anymore, Lorado. Neither is your father's love." Those words broke her. That night, rain poured as Lorado packed her few belongings into a suitcase. Standing in the driveway, she looked back at the mansion that once felt like home. Tears mixed with the rain as she whispered, "Never again." Then she walked away, her heart shattered but her spirit beginning to burn with something new: strength. Months passed since Lorado walked away from her father's house that rainy night. Life had become hard, painfully different from the comfort she once knew. She rented a small room in a noisy part of Johannesburg, barely big enough for her books and dreams. Every morning she woke up before sunrise, put on her worn-out shoes, and went to work at a little cafe near campus. The pay was small, but it kept her fed and helped her stay in school. Between shifts, she studied late into the night, reminding herself that education was her only way out. Still, there were nights she cried quietly, missing her father. She wondered if he ever asked about her, if he still believed the lies Thandi told him. She never got the chance to find out. One cold morning, while serving coffee, she overheard customers talking about a big funeral in Sandton, Mr. Malef's funeral. Her hands froze midair. Her father was gone. No one had called her. No message. No letter. Nothing. Thandi and Cabello had buried her father without even telling her. Heart pounding, she left work early and took a taxi to the cemetery, hoping to at least say goodbye. But when she got there, she saw Thandi and Cabello standing beside a fancy marble grave surrounded by cameras and expensive cars. Lorado walked up slowly, holding flowers she'd bought with her last few coins. Before she could reach the grave, Cabello stepped forward and blocked her path. His face was full of hatred. "You don't belong here," he hissed. "Go back to wherever you came from." Lorado stood frozen, tears burning her eyes. "He was my father too," she whispered, but Cabello only laughed. Thandi looked away, pretending not to see her. The security guards started moving closer, and Lorado realized she wasn't welcome, not even at her own father's grave. She dropped the flowers on the ground and walked away, her heart breaking all over again. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her father's death didn't feel right. He had been sick, yes, but something inside her whispered that there was more to the story. Thandi had taken control of everything so quickly: the mansion, the businesses, the land, and now she was acting like Lorado never existed. It didn't make sense. Lorado sat by the window, staring at the dark sky, anger mixing with grief. She remembered her father's smile, his promises, and the love that once filled their home. She couldn't let it end like this, with lies, greed, and silence. Wiping her tears, she made herself a promise. She would find out the truth about her father's death and what really happened to everything he worked. In that moment, something changed inside her. The weak girl they had thrown out was gone. What was left was a woman ready to fight, for her father, for justice, and for herself. One night, months after her father's funeral, Lorado was working late at the university's law clinic. The office was quiet except for the sound of papers rustling and the hum of the old fluorescent light. She was helping an elderly lawyer named Mr. Ndlovu organize files for a property dispute. He was kind, patient, and always encouraged her to keep pushing forward, even when life felt unfair. As they worked, he glanced at the name tag on her file and suddenly stopped. "Malef?" he asked softly. "Lorado Malef?" She looked up, a little surprised. "Yes," she said. "That was my father's name too." Mr. Ndlovu's eyes widened. "Mr. Malef from Sandton? The businessman?" Lorado nodded slowly. He leaned back in his chair, looking like he'd just seen a ghost. "My dear," he said, "I used to work for your father years ago. I handled some of his legal paperwork." Lorado's heart started to race. "You knew my father?" she asked. He nodded, his expression turning serious. He was a good man. Always spoke proudly of his daughter, the one studying law. But then I lost contact when he remarried. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There's something you should know." He pulled out an old folder from his briefcase, yellowed at the edges. Your father made a will before he got sick. I remember it clearly because I helped draft it. In that will, half of his estate was meant for you. The businesses, the land, everything. But after he fell ill, your stepmother took control, and that original will disappeared. Lorato felt her stomach twist. Disappeared? What do you mean? I mean, he said carefully, a new will suddenly appeared, one that gave everything to Thandie and her son. It never sat right with me, but I was pushed out of the picture before I could ask questions. Her hands trembled as she tried to process what he was saying. Do you have proof? She whispered. Mr. Ndlova looked at her sadly, then reached into his bag again. He handed her a faded photocopy. I kept this for my records, he said. I knew something wasn't right. Your father wanted to protect you. Lorato stared at the paper, her eyes blurring with tears. Her name was right there, Lorato Molef, written clearly in her father's own handwriting. It was the proof she had never known existed. All the anger, confusion, and grief she had buried came rushing back. They hadn't just taken her father's love or her home. They had stolen her future and forged lies to erase her completely. She looked at Mr. Ndlovu, her voice steady for the first time in a long while. If what you're saying is true, she said, then they committed a crime. Mr. Ndlova nodded. And if you're ready, Lorato, we can prove it. That night, as she walked home under the city lights, she held the photocopy close to her chest. For the first time in years, she felt something powerful, hope. The truth was finally on her side, and she was ready to fight for it. When Lorato decided to take her stepmother and half-brother to court, she knew it wouldn't be easy. Thandie and Cabello were powerful, wealthy, and connected. She was just a struggling law student with barely enough money to pay her rent. But with Mr. Ndlovu by her side and the faded photocopy of her father's real will in her hands, she finally had the truth and the courage to fight. They worked for weeks preparing the case. Mr. Ndlova guided her through every step, teaching her how to build a solid argument. Together, they filed charges against Thandie and Cabello for fraud, forgery, and illegal possession of property. When the news broke, Johannesburg couldn't stop talking about it. The media called it the Molef family war. Headlines painted Lorato as either a brave daughter fighting for justice or a bitter woman chasing money that wasn't hers. At first, almost no one believed her. The Molef family had money, lawyers, and a spotless public image. Thandie appeared on interviews looking heartbroken, saying things like, Lorato is confused. She doesn't understand how her father's affairs were handled. Cabello went further, calling her a delusional dropout who wants attention. Every word stung, but Lorato refused to respond. She stayed quiet, letting her work speak for her. As the weeks passed, the investigation started to uncover shocking detail. Mr. Ndlova's team found suspicious bank transfers made right after Mr. Molef fell sick. Large amounts of money moved from his business accounts into Thandie's name. Then came proof of forged signatures on key documents, including the new will that had magically appeared after his death. The biggest discovery came when Lorato traced a hidden offshore account under Cabello's name. It was filled with millions that were supposed to belong to the company her father built. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and suddenly Lorato's story didn't sound so crazy anymore. Social media exploded. People who once doubted her began cheering her on. Justice for Lorato started trending on Twitter. Journalists dug into Thandie's background, exposing her shady business deals and the way she manipulated Mr. Molef's estate. Thandie, who once looked so confident, started avoiding cameras. Cabello tried to laugh it off, saying the media had nothing better to do, but even he began to look nervous. Lorato, on the other hand, grew stronger. She spent long nights reviewing documents, learning every law that could help her case. She knew this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about respect, truth, and finally standing up for herself. On the day they finally went to court, she walked through the crowd of flashing cameras with her head high. People whispered her name as she passed, but she didn't flinch. Inside, she sat next to Mr. Ndlovu, eyes fixed forward. The fight for justice had truly begun, and this time, she wasn't the one running away. The courtroom was packed the morning Lorato finally faced Thandie and Cabello. Reporters filled every seat, cameras flashing as soon as she walked in. She looked calm, dressed in a simple black suit, her hair neatly tied back. But inside, her heart raced. This was it, the day she'd been fighting for. On the other side of the room sat Thandie, dressed in expensive clothes and pretending to look heartbroken. Cabello sat beside her, smirking as if the whole thing was a joke. When the trial began, Thandie's lawyer went straight for Lorato. He painted her as a greedy young woman hungry for money and attention. She was never close to her father, he said confidently. She left home on her own, and now she wants to steal from the family that actually cared for Mr. Molef. Every word felt like a slap. The lawyer made it sound as if Lorato was some stranger trying to take what wasn't hers. But Lorato didn't flinch. She waited patiently, her face unreadable. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up slowly and walked to the front. "I didn't come here for money," she began softly. "I came for the truth." Her voice shook for a moment, but then she steadied herself. One by one, she began presenting her evidence. She handed over signed documents that matched the old will Mr. Ndlovu had kept. She showed proof of Thandi's bank transfers made just days before her father's health suddenly worsened. The room grew quiet. Even the judge leaned forward, his expression tightening. Then came the moment that changed everything. Lorato took a deep breath, opened her bag, and played a secret voice recording on her phone. The courtroom filled with Thandi's voice, sharp and cold. "Your father never meant for you to have anything," she said on the recording. "He chose us, not you." The room gasped. Thandi's face went pale, her lawyer froze mid-sentence, and the judge looked stunned. Even Cabello's smirk disappeared. The truth was out in the open. Lorato's eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. "They took my father, my home, and my peace," she said, her gaze fixed on Thandi. "But they won't take justice." Her words echoed through the courtroom, leaving a heavy silence behind. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the judge cleared his throat and called for a short recess. Reporters rushed out of the room to spread the news. Lorato Molefe had proof of fraud. As Lorato sat down, her hands trembling, Mr. Ndlovu leaned over and whispered, "You did it, my girl. You just turned the tide." Across the room, Thandi sat frozen, her perfect world beginning to crumble. Cabello glared at Lorato, but she didn't even look his way. She wasn't that broken girl anymore. She was the woman her father had raised, brave, relentless, and finally standing in her own power. Weeks later, the final day of the trial arrived. The courthouse in Johannesburg was overflowing with people. Reporters filled every corner, microphones ready, cameras flashing. Everyone wanted to see how the famous Molefe family war would end. Outside, people held signs that read justice for Lorato. Inside, Lorato sat quietly beside Mr. Ndlovu, her hands clasped tightly. She had barely slept, her heart heavy with hope and fear. Thandi sat across the room looking drained and anxious. The elegant, confident woman who once controlled everything now looked fragile and lost. Cabello kept pacing, his anger barely contained. The judge entered, and the room went silent. Everyone rose to their feet. The air felt thick, tense enough to make even the strongest person hold their breath. When the judge finally began to speak, every word felt like thunder. "After reviewing the evidence," he said, "this court finds Thandi Molefe and Cabello Molefe guilty of fraud and forgery." Gasps filled the room. Lorato's heart stopped for a second. The judge continued, his tone firm and final. "All assets, including the Molefe estate, businesses, and properties, are to be transferred to the rightful heir, Ms. Lorato Molefe." The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing like lightning. Thandi's face went white, her body trembling before she suddenly fainted in her chair. Cabello jumped up, shouting, "You can't do this to us. This isn't over." But the judge ignored him. The decision was final. Justice had been served. Tears welled up in Lorato's eyes. For a moment, she couldn't move. It didn't feel real. After everything she had lost, her home, her name, her father's love, she had finally won it all back. Mr. Ndlovu placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "He'd be proud of you." Outside the courthouse, the media went wild. News channels reported the story across the country. Lorato Molefe wins $950 million case against stepmother and half-brother. People who once doubted her now praised her courage. Strangers called her a symbol of justice and strength. As she stepped out into the sunlight, the crowd erupted in cheers. Reporters shouted questions. Flashes went off from every direction, but Lorato didn't flinch. She walked forward slowly, head held high, her calm presence commanding more respect than any words could. She paused on the courthouse steps and looked up at the sky for a brief moment. "We did it, Papa," she whispered softly under her breath. The wind brushed against her face as if answering her. In that moment, she wasn't just a girl who had been betrayed. She was a woman who had reclaimed her power. The same family that tried to erase her name had now made her one of the most powerful women in South Africa. And as she walked through the flashing cameras and shouting voices, Lorato Molefe smiled for the first time in a long time. Not out of victory, but out of peace. After the verdict, Lorato's name was everywhere. Her face was on magazine covers, TV shows, and online news headlines. People called her the girl who beat the system and South Africa's strongest daughter. But while the country celebrated, Lorato quietly disappeared. She turned down interviews, stopped checking her phone, and moved out of the city. She found a small, peaceful villa on the outskirts of Johannesburg, tucked between green hills and tall trees. It was quiet there, no cameras, no noise, no chaos. Each morning, she woke up to the sound of birds instead of reporters shouting her name. The air was calm, almost healing. But even in the silence, her heart wasn't at peace. Her new house was beautiful, but it didn't feel like home. The mansion she once lived in with her father had been filled with memories, his laughter, the smell of his cologne, the sound of him calling her my star. Now she had everything he had left her, the money, the businesses, the land, yet she felt like she had nothing. Victory had never felt so lonely. Some nights, Lorado would sit by the window with a cup of tea, looking at the city lights far below. She kept her father's photo on the bedside table, the same picture from her childhood, with his arm around her shoulders. Every night, before turning off the lamp, she whispered, "We won, Papa, but I wish you were here." Her voice always cracked a little when she said it. People thought she was celebrating somewhere in luxury, but she was really learning how to breathe again. She spent her days reading, walking, and writing letters she never sent. Letters to her father. Letters to the girl she used to be. Letters to Thandi and Cabello, not filled with anger, but with sadness. No amount of money could fill the space they had carved out of her heart. Sometimes she would scroll through old photos on her phone, pictures from her childhood before everything fell apart. Her father smiling at her graduation, her mother holding her as a baby. The more she looked, the more she realized that her victory had cost her something far greater than money could ever replace. But even in her loneliness, there was a quiet strength growing inside her. She had faced betrayal, humiliation, and loss, yet she had survived. And more than that, she had won justice. Still, when night came and the world outside grew dark, she'd lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, feeling that familiar ache. She had proven everyone wrong, but a part of her still longed for the simple things she could never buy back. The warmth of her father's love and the peace of a home that wasn't built on pain. While Lorado found peace in silence, life for Thandi and Cabello fell apart piece by piece. The same family that once looked untouchable now lived like fugitives in their own city. The court's verdict had frozen all their bank accounts, seized their cars, and stripped them of every business they once owned. The mansion in Sandton, once filled with luxury and laughter, now stood empty, locked behind iron gates with a "for sale" sign outside. Thandi and Cabello were forced to move into a small apartment in a crowded part of Johannesburg. Gone were the designer clothes, private drivers, and expensive dinners. Now they took taxis and shared one old couch that barely fit in their new living room. Their neighbors whispered when they passed by. "That's them," they would say. "The Moleffs who stole from their own blood." Every time Thandi heard it, her heart sank a little lower. The story spread everywhere. Patrick, one of Thandi's old friends from her social circle, leaked private details to the media. The headline hit the internet within hours. "The stepmother who stole from her stepdaughter." Photos of Thandi crying outside the courthouse went viral. People who once begged to be at her parties now avoided her. Cabello, who used to brag about being rich, couldn't even find a decent job. Their phones stopped ringing. The friends who once called them family vanished overnight. Cabello grew angry, bitter, and restless. He spent hours shouting, blaming Thandi for everything. "You did this," he yelled one night, slamming his fist on the table. "If you hadn't been so greedy, we'd still have everything." Thandi barely responded anymore. She sat on the couch staring at nothing, her once beautiful face now pale and tired. The guilt had eaten away at her. She replayed Lorado's words in her head every night. "They took my father, my home, and my peace. But they won't take justice." The truth haunted her like a ghost. As the weeks passed, Thandi's health started to fail. The stress, the shame, and the endless arguments with Cabello took their toll. She stopped eating properly, lost weight, and often coughed until she could barely breathe. Cabello, too wrapped up in his anger, hardly noticed. He spent his days online, reading hateful comments about himself and trying to defend their name, but no one cared anymore. One evening, as rain poured outside, Thandi sat by the window watching the cars pass. Her reflection stared back at her, tired, broken, and unrecognizable. For the first time in years, she whispered the words she had never said out loud. "I'm sorry, Lorado." Tears rolled down her face as she realized it was too late. The woman who once had everything, money, power, and control, now had nothing but regret. And in that quiet, empty apartment, surrounded by silence and bitterness, Thandi finally felt the true weight of what she had done. It was a cold, rainy afternoon when Lorado heard the sound of knocking at her gate. She was sitting in her living room, reading quietly while the rain tapped against the windows. The knock came again, slow, hesitant, almost afraid. Her guard appeared at the door a few moments later, his expression uneasy. "Miss Lorado," he said softly, "there are two people outside asking to see you." She frowned. "Who?" "It's Mrs. Moleff and her son," he said. Lorado froze. For a moment, she thought she'd misheard him. But when she stepped out to the porch and looked through the rain, she saw them, Thandi and Cabello, standing at the gate, soaked to the bone. They looked nothing like the people she remembered. The woman who once wore diamonds and silk was now shivering in an old coat, her makeup washed away by the rain. Cabello stood beside her, thinner, his pride gone, his eyes full of shame. "Please, Lorado," Thandi cried, her voice weak. We have nowhere else to go. They took everything. We don't even have food. Her words broke the silence, trembling through the air. For a long moment, Lorado said nothing. She just looked at them, the same way they once looked at her when they threw her out years ago. Back then, she had begged too, standing in the rain, heartbroken and alone. The memory cut deep. Finally, she stepped closer to the gate. Her tone was calm, steady. You taught me how it feels to be thrown out with nothing, she said. And I swore I'd never be that cruel to anyone. Thandy's lips quivered. Please, we're sorry. Lorado's eyes softened for just a moment, but her voice stayed firm. I won't do the same to you, she said. You'll get food and money to help you get back on your feet. But don't mistake kindness for forgiveness. Cabello looked down, silent, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Thandy started to cry, her tears mixing with the rain. She tried to reach out through the gate, but Lorado stepped back. I can't change the past, she said quietly, but I can choose not to become like you. She turned to the guard. Give them a few blankets, food, and some cash. Then make sure they get a taxi to somewhere safe. Yes, Miss Lorado, the guard replied and went to do as she said. Thandy fell to her knees, her voice barely a whisper. You're stronger than I ever was, she said, tears streaming down her face. Lorado didn't reply. She simply turned and walked back toward the house, her white coat glowing faintly under the gray sky. As the gate closed behind her, the rain kept falling, washing away the bitterness of the past. Thandy and Cabello stood there in silence, realizing that Lorado had become everything they could never be, strong, fair, and unbroken. The sky was calm and golden as Lorado walked through the cemetery, a small bouquet of white lilies in her hand. The air was cool, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain. She stopped in front of her father's grave, the name Fomolef carved neatly into the marble stone. For a long moment, she just stood there, silent, tracing the letters with her fingers. So much has changed, Papa, she whispered softly. They said I'd never win. They said I'd never matter. But sometimes, pain is the lawyer that builds your strongest case. Her voice cracked a little, but there was peace in her eyes, the kind that only comes after surviving a storm. She knelt down, placed the flowers neatly on the grave, and smiled faintly. We did it, she said. Justice is yours now, and I'll make sure no one else goes through what I did. For a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the wind brush against her face, as if her father's spirit was there with her. Then she stood, brushed off her coat, and walked back toward her car parked near the gate. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As she got in and started the engine, the radio came on, a news anchor's voice filling the car. Today, Lorado Molef announced the launch of the Molef Foundation for Justice, an organization dedicated to helping women fight inheritance fraud and financial abuse. Lorado smiled quietly as she drove off, the golden light reflecting off the car's windows. The camera would follow her car as it disappeared down the road, fading slowly into the sunset. Then the screen would go black, and one final message would appear. They tried to bury me, but I was the seed.